Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Really grateful to have David Sanger to talk about his new book, which we'll jump into in a second, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David is the White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, reports on the president, the administration. He's worked at the, I'm going to not bring up your age, by the way, but he's worked at the Times for more than 4 decades, starting 2 months after he graduated from Harvard. And that makes him, for better or worse, probably for better, one of the longest serving correspondents at the Times. And that dates back, I know, to before there was even a virtual way to read the paper, just the printed copy. So you've been there for a while.
Yes, back in the days when we actually thought you could merge ink on paper, and that was all you needed to do.
Well, I still subscribe to that version of the paper. So
thank goodness.
He's worked on several Pulitzer Prize-winning teams: the Challenger disaster, the Russian investigation. I think there's one more.
One on Chinese. U.S. exports to China of military gear in the late 1990s.
Late 1990s. Yeah. Native of White Plains, New York. One of the things that I found most interesting in doing a little bit of extra research on David, since I've known him for some time, is his 3 most vital items that he brings with him. Probably not going to get this from the book, but this is just extra fodder. 1, noise-canceling headphones. I don't know if you still do this. 2, a small shortwave radio. And 3, a 7-piece 4-weight fly rod that breaks down to fit into a tube under a foot long.
That's right.
So that means wherever you are, if there's a chance to fish, you're going to get at it.
I'm going to slip out and try to go do it. I don't think the G7 in Italy is going to sort of lend itself to that next month, but we can try.
All right, well, maybe there's a way to get up to Lake Como or something like that.
I'm not sure there are any fish in there. A lot of celebrities, but I'm not sure there are any fish.
Well, thank you for coming. David, we could just start off with the title, which has been somewhat controversial. The title is not the New Cold War. The word war is plural here. So the New Cold Wars. And congratulations, you hit the New York Times bestseller list.
Thank you.
Right off the bat. Can you describe to us a little bit what the New Cold Wars, why plural? And then we'll go from there.
Well, this is a book about how it is that the United States made some fundamentally wrong assumptions, along with our allies, about where we'd be today. When I came back to Washington after a happy life as a foreign correspondent in Japan, the assumption at the moment was that the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed, we had won the Cold War, and that Russia and China, each in their own ways, would basically sign on to Western institutions, the whole Western experiment. And while there would be frictions back and forth, because we're big countries with different interests, that fundamentally we'd all be rowing in the same direction. And so the first 150 pages of the book is sort of a history that I put together with my wonderful researcher and co-writer on this, Mary Brooks, who some of you in the audience may know. And so we went back and sort of interviewed all of the principals who were still around on the question of, how did we get this so wrong? I mean, talk about either intelligence failures or wishful thinking or just faulty assumptions. But, you know, the first chapter, Seth, opens with George W. Bush and his wife, Laura, and Putin and his then wife floating down a yacht on the Neva River right around this time of year, end of May, early June, sun barely sets, you know, maybe at around 11 o'clock or close to midnight. And the conversation on that boat, I was in the pool boat, we were less well-fed and we had much less expensive vodka.
It didn't sink though. So
it didn't sink. But we were brought on the yacht briefly to sort of see the leaders There's this hulking guy in the background who was serving dinner. It took me 20 years to confirm my suspicion about who that was, but it was exactly who you would think it was, Prigozhin, who reappears as a character later on. So all the characters in the book are on the scene, and this is a narrative history. This is not an academic work of study. This is an out-reported book with real-life characters interacting with each other over these 30 years. And the discussion on that boat at that time, Seth, was when, not if, when Russia would join the European Union, and whether Russia, which already had an office inside the gates of NATO, the Russia-NATO Council, could ultimately join NATO, the alliance created to contain the old Soviet Union. So fast forward to where we are today. All the signals we missed from Putin, from his speech in the Munich Security Conference in 2007, saying there are parts of Russia that have been ripped apart away from us that must come back together, to the invasion of Crimea, which we didn't really respond to in a serious way for a year, to signing up to the Nord Stream 2 deal, which Angela Merkel did a year after Crimea, saying Putin was a reliable supplier. How we underplayed every signal this was going wrong, and overplayed every signal that they were cooperating on climate or containing Iran or containing the North Korean nuclear program. And then for China, a different story, but comes out in the same place, where the big misjudgment was Xi Jinping and what he would do, and the intelligence reports, which you'll read about in the book, that basically said he would bide his time, focus on the domestic economy. And so now we're ending up with those new Cold Wars. Wars with an S, because Russia and China are working together. They're not full allies, but they're doing exactly what Nixon and Kissinger tried to get in the way of. And I was here, I think it was either this was upstairs, for that Kissinger 100th birthday party. And you may remember this. And Kissinger that night talked a little about what the objective was in keeping Russia and China apart. And he's gone now, but in many ways, so is the success of that effort.
So how would you describe the current situation? What are the characteristics of the Cold War, of the Cold Wars? The way you sort of describe it at various parts of the book is globalization now, that's out. There's an element of self-reliance and nationalism,
right,
that's in.
Right.
So how would you describe what now Cold War, those key characteristics of what we're in right now are?
Well, you said at the beginning, Seth, and you were absolutely right, there's been some controversy about the title, and a lot of my academic friends say this is so different from the old Cold, you shouldn't even be calling it a Cold War. Some of them are saying this, including in the administration, out of a desire that it not become a Cold War. In fact, Biden himself, in his first address to the United Nations as president, said in relation to China, it was before the invasion of Ukraine, we're not headed to another Cold War. It's interesting that since the book came out, they have not pushed back on the title, because it seems so obvious that what we're in now does not look exactly like the old Cold War. Why would it? The internet not only hadn't been invented or hadn't become widespread when I joined the New York Times, it also hadn't become widespread during the old Cold War. So, I mean, we're in a very different moment. But I was trained by Ernie May, the great Harvard historian, who wrote a wonderful book about the uses and misuses of analogy that I keep right by my computer, lest I reach for the wrong analogy in sometimes news analysis or whatever. It's called, if you ever want to cross, particularly for the students in the audience, an old copy of it on Amazon or something, it's called Thinking in Time. And it's just a great read about how you think about these things. But Ernie had a great habit, which was whenever you were about to go use an analogy, like to the old Cold War here, you took a piece of paper, You put a line down the middle, and you did similarities on one side, and you did differences on the other. And the differences here are a lot bigger and a longer list than the similarities. The similarities are striking, but the list is longer on the other side. So during the old Cold War, we had a single adversary. Now we have two, vastly complicating it. It was almost entirely a military conflict, and within that a nuclear conflict, but we knew who we were dealing with. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, we got into sort of a pattern of, I wouldn't call it stability, but predictability. There was a red phone at our end, a red phone at their end. You sort of knew who was going to answer it at the other end. You sometimes practiced answering it at the other end. This is so much different because with China, we have an economic competitor, a military competitor, a cultural competitor. If you don't believe that, then you don't have TikTok on your phone. And those have nothing
I don't actually.
You don't.
But I may or may not have kids that do.
When it gets banned, then it's going to be a very fast process. You're not going to, right? And obviously, along the way, it's a technology conflict. And the book argues it's primarily a technology conflict. We can get into that later on. That wasn't the case with Russia. We were dependent on them for absolutely nothing except caviar and vodka, and we would not want to live without those things, but if we had to, we'd stumble through.
But it was cold in the sense that there was no direct conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We fought along the margins. We fought indirectly in El Salvador, and Guatemala, and Vietnam. And at least so far, there has not been direct conflict as well. So the competition right now is cold. And cold, I don't think you mean cold doesn't mean without war, because obviously we have that in Ukraine. But cold, for the moment, does mean that we have not seen direct conflict. And I think that has been one of President Biden's objectives in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, President Biden has laid out two objectives. One is don't let the Russians win. He hasn't quite said the Ukrainians should win, but by don't let the Russians win, he means don't let them take over the country, and its territories. He hasn't defined it much. And don't stumble into World War III, which is why he has not allowed us to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, where they could, die in a missile attack. You've just been there. You know what it's like when you're scrambling down into the basements, into the bunkers. From our conversation before, I think you may have had an evening of that. The second part is don't allow U.S. arms to be fired into Russia on the theory that would get you on an escalation ladder. And that's the argument that is coming under a lot of stress now. You may have seen a story I wrote last week saying that Secretary Blinken, when he came back from his most recent trip to Ukraine, which I think was just a week or two after you were there, basically said to the president, we've got to lift that given the changed circumstances of the war moving up near Kyiv.
What is your sense about the pros and cons of that? A number of NATO countries, including the British, have had very different views. They are at a place right now where it's okay for the British to provide weapons to the Ukraine and for the Ukrainians to use them on Russian soil against military or other logistical targets, oil reserves, weapons depots, military bases. I think some of these countries, including the British, at least my conversations with senior British leaders, would be a little different if they were targeting civilian populations in Russia. But what is your sense about the debate now, even since you wrote that story, about where the debate is in the U.S., and do you have thoughts on whether concerns are a bit of self-deterrence, potentially exaggerated on our part?
So the whole history of our involvement with Ukraine, as described in the book, and the book takes you through the internal White House debate over revealing the intelligence, something I think Avril Haines may have discussed some when she was here, and then takes you into the decisions that Biden made. he was very concerned from the beginning about nuclear escalation. And this is partly a product of who he is. I mean, he grew up in the old Cold War, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee when the overwhelming goal was, let's bring down the size of our nuclear arsenals, let's lessen the possibilities that we're going to use nuclear weapons. Was in the Obama administration, whose mantra was, let's take nuclear weapons out of the center parts of defense policy. And I think what he saw was the possibility that this could go nuclear very quickly. And I think the most striking chapter in the book is the one where he shows up in New York City in the second week or third week of October of 2022 at a fundraiser at the home of James Murdoch, who was the black sheep Democrat of the Murdoch family. And people are walking around, nice glasses of wine in their hands, looking at the Murdoch art collection, which is quite impressive. And in walks Biden, and he's clearly preoccupied with something. And he says to this whole group, actually, I'll read you the line. It's on the back cover of the book. He said on this night, for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat of the use of a nuclear weapon if, in fact, things continue down the path they are going. And initially, people are looking at him like, is he thinking like in the future? And they realize as he keeps talking, he's talking about like in the next week or two. So he keeps talking. They keep thinking about how quickly they can get out to the Hamptons and start digging tunnels. And this was based on a series of very highly classified intercepts that the U.S. had.
Which you get into in the book, by the way, so another good reason to read.
Yeah, in some considerable detail. Probably a little more detail than I think the U.S. government cared for me to get into them. But by this point, the Russians had understood what we had because we made it pretty clear to them. In which Russian military commanders were overheard talking to each other about rolling out tactical nuclear weapons. These are battlefield nuclear weapons, but some of them in the Russian arsenal more powerful than what we dropped on Hiroshima, presumably for use against Ukrainian targets. And if they had done this, and if this conversation wasn't just for show, it would have been the first use of a nuclear weapon by a nuclear-armed state against a non-nuclear armed state since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Biden was concerned this would change the world because we would have to go respond, not in a nuclear way, but probably with a conventional strike on whatever bases the Russians used to launch this. Nobody knew how the Russians would respond. And at one point in that conversation that night, the president says, once you start down that path, you're in Armageddon. This was not what these nice, wealthy East Siders had come to hear that evening. Right? They were thinking initially about where their after-party dinner reservations were, and he was telling you we might be in a nuclear exchange in the next few weeks. In fact, his aides thought at that point that under some circumstances there was a 50-50 chance of a nuclear detonation in October of 2022. And most Americans were wandering around completely oblivious to this. In fact, the night he said this, I started looking at the transcript that's coming in, and I call up somebody at the White House, and I said, what is the president saying here? And he said, oh, God, he just gave us that talk in the Oval the other day. So if you want to hear what Biden's really thinking, go to fundraisers.
All right. But that means you've got to donate a fair amount before you go.
Yeah, well, go as a reporter, and that way you don't have to contribute. But, so what have you seen the Russians do in the past week? Last week, amid all of this discussion from the French about putting troops on the ground and Zelensky urging the administration to allow him to fire into Russian territory, they begin to run a very public tactical nuclear weapon exercise. So Putin is using his nuclear weapons every single day in this conflict. as the thing he can wave around to say, don't you push this too far. And the U.S. debate, a fascinating U.S. debate, which the president has never really come back to talking about in public, is how much do you let that deter you? Or do you come to the conclusion, I can't let him do that, and I'm willing to take some more risk? And I think that's the argument the president's in right now. If you listen to his commencement speech at West Point on Saturday, you wouldn't have gotten a single clue of this. He just went on and made the same old arguments about helping Ukraine stay free.
So do you think the administration has essentially self-deterred out of concern that whether it's striking targets in Ukraine or providing types of weapon systems, that it risks escalation, including to nuclear war? Do you give validity to the argument?
I think they recovered from it in a chapter called Boiling the Frog. As the temperature rose, they made decisions, the president made decisions to give the Ukrainians weapons that in February of 2022, he was not willing to go give them. You know, initially they said, no way are we giving you ATACMS. We first gave them the short range. Now we've given them the long range. He said, there's no way we're going to let you have F-16s. At the last Hiroshima G7 summit, they agreed to allow the F-16s, and they're supposed to be there fall, is that?
Well, summer, but there's been some delays.
Yeah,
so.
It's a pilot training thing, and it's complex. The U.S. said, we will not give you Abrams tanks, and they're not suited for the region. But in an effort to free up the European, much more flexible tanks, we gave them Abrams tanks. The Russians have captured one and put it on display in Moscow.
So I want to come back to two other components of the new Cold Wars, because I think they're interesting. I mean, every period is different. This is a different period from the last Cold War, and it's been different from other periods. But you do say in the book that there are some features of today's geopolitical era that are, at least in part, 1914, part 1941, part 2022, and it's partly the way the war has evolved in Ukraine. So how do you look at, not just during the Cold War, but other historical contexts, and what do you pull lessons from about where we are right now?
So this has been what's been remarkable about Ukraine as a war. First of all, it's been a huge training ground for the United States. I mean, if somebody had come to you as a simulation here at CSIS and said, for 6% or 7% of the defense budget, you can actually take on the Russian army and see what works and what doesn't, you'd probably say, that's a pretty good bargain, because we've learned a lot along the way. Systems that work and systems that don't. I'll get back to it in a minute. That discussion of 1914, 1941, 2022 came out of a long dinner that Mary Brooks and I had with the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he was making the point that the assumption at the opening of the war was that this could be a nice, clean cyber war. Because, of course, the Russians had gone after Ukraine to turn off the power on several occasions in 2016 and 2017. Then he said it looked like a World War II tank war as the ground action took off. And then, and I'll clean up the language for a nice CSIS forum here. Yes, he said it ended up looking like a blanking trench warfare from World War I. And you know, this is really what we're seeing. We're seeing all three wrapped up. I mean, at the opening days of the war, what saved Ukraine, in addition to the U.S. rushing in aid, was that Microsoft and Amazon World Systems moved the entire government of Ukraine into the cloud. It required a change of law in Ukraine, and they did it in a week. And then, because nobody in the US government had planned for the question of how do you communicate with your government in the cloud, Elon Musk, whatever you might think of his other ventures in the world and other statements, came in and saved them with Starlink and showed us all along the way how vulnerable our own multi-billion-dollar satellite systems are being on. And that's why Starshield, the sort of classified version of Starlink, ultimately, I suspect, will end up replacing almost all that we have up in space today. We learned some other lessons. The Ukrainians are making drones, as a chapter in the book, toward the end of the book describes in here, for $350 a piece, welded together or soldered together, I should say, by high school kids in like old abandoned factories.
I met some of them when I was there.
It's pretty remarkable.
They're Frankenstein drones in a sense. They're soldered together, but they're in some cases quite effective.
They can be, and they've been less effective lately because the Russians have finally figured out the electronic warfare techniques that they could have used from the beginning but didn't, right? Which is in and of itself pretty interesting. We roll in with our tens of thousands of dollars made in America Skyeo drones to help them out. And every single one of them gets taken down by the Russians in the first 48 hours or so. Okay, back to the drawing boards with that. At least we found out now in Ukraine rather than find out in a conflict over a NATO country. So when I say this is really an area of experimentation, I mean it. So the war is the strangest combination of old brutality of being stuck in the trenches, and a bit along the way of learning how cyber integrates with ground warfare. When I wrote The Perfect Weapon in 2018, there were still people who thought there was going to be cyber war and then traditional war. And the argument I made in that book was, this is more like aircraft in World War I, where we thought there would be air wars and regular wars, and eventually the aircraft got fighter jets, bombers, all got merged in with ordinary warfare. And that's what we've seen happen in this conflict in Ukraine with cyber.
So one of the things, you do discuss it in the book, is can you draw out some of the differences in the role of companies and how this has changed? Because one of the interesting things about Ukraine, you mentioned Microsoft getting directly involved and Amazon Web Services directly involved in the conflict, at least on the cyber defense side. You mentioned SpaceX, but it's the list of companies that have gone to Ukraine and have provided services directly to the Ukrainian government. Palantir, Anduril, the satellite companies, commercial satellite companies, Hawkeye 360, Maxar, Planet. I can't think of another case, of another war where we've had such private sector involvement. We certainly have had in previous wars with DynCorp contractors or others, but is this a new prelude to how the future of these Cold Wars are and what the struggle is going to look like?
It may well be, but we've learned along the way there are some risks in doing it this way. So at the beginning of the war, this seemed like such a clear moral cause that it wasn't hard for companies to sign up right away. I mean, Microsoft made no bones about the fact that they were going to help the Ukrainians and pull their operations out of Russia. And AWS, though not as public, did the same thing, and you named many of the others. It would be a lot harder case if it wasn't such a blatant act of aggression where the companies weren't quite certain where they were going to be, or if it involved China, where the cost of giving up the Chinese market for some companies, not for others, because a lot of tech companies have been excluded from the Chinese market, would be so much higher than giving up Russia. I mean, for some of these companies, Russia was 1 or 2 or 3% of revenue. I mean, they'd hate to lose it, but lots of things can go wrong where you lose a lot more revenue. Wasn't really a hard decision. The second risk that you run is that the companies end up playing national security advisor. And that's what happened when Elon Musk gets that phone call that Walter Isaacson first described in his Musk biography, where the Ukrainians ask him to turn Starlink on for Crimea, where it was not covering at that time, so that they could strike a bunch of Russian ships that were sitting in the harbor. And he refused, because someone had told him that if we do that, sort of the Biden argument we were discussing before, it would start a nuclear war. So, you know, he made his decision. It's his company. It's a private company. Do you want a somewhat, how do I politely refer to this, eccentric billionaire? Is that polite enough? Yeah. Making the decision about whether or not you give the Ukrainians a critical weapon that they want? Would you like that to be debated in the Situation Room, even if you didn't like the outcome? Or would you rather that be made in a boardroom or by one founder? And that's the difficulty that we're heading into here. That if these are not in some way deeply coordinated with the US government, every company is not only going to be running their own foreign policy, they're going to be running their own defense policy.
That is, it's interesting. The Chinese have already signaled to Elon Musk and Starlink and SpaceX that a decision to provide that type of assistance to Taiwan in case of a contingency would not be received well.
And the Chinese have things they could do to the Starlink network that no other country could go do. Maybe Putin could do if he ends up placing a nuclear weapon in space. But that whole argument, which came out in February, that he was planning to go do it, and he has not yet done it as far as we can tell, is a fascinating one, because if he detonated this, it would not only take out American satellites, it would take out Chinese satellites. So it's one of those opportunities the US has to drive a wedge between that Russian-Chinese partnership.
So I want to come back to a few different aspects of both China and Russia, but also ask you about the Iranians and the North Koreans. But before I do that, I want to ask about your sense of strategy. This is page 435, the beginning of the epilogue. You write, Biden's conclusion in 2022 that the post-Cold War era is definitely over was an effort to thrust the country into the new reality. Yet he stopped short of offering a vision of what this new era might look like. Are you seeing a vision of how to deal with this new, as you call it, Cold Wars? As you sort of talk historically about various strategies to deal with the Chinese and Russians, in the book, you highlight various issues like engagement, that's certainly the case with China, or containment. But how do you see the debate right now over what strategy or strategies the U.S. and others should circle around to deal with the current situation?
So let's start with China and its allies, because on the one hand, the U.S. has been successful, I think, in keeping the Chinese from direct entry into the Ukraine war, but they have, as you and I have discussed before, been providing dual-use technology that is of critical use to the Russians, and they've been buying oil. So they have not participated in the U.S. effort to isolate the Russians along the way. And I think what you have seen happen, and I wouldn't call this strategy as much as just the way the world has unfolded, is you've begun to see a new Iron Curtain of some kind, the physical manifestation of which is somewhere in the Netherlands of southern and eastern Ukraine, where there will be a line one day. It may be a Korea-like armistice line, as I describe at the end here. I can't imagine a negotiated settlement over a firm line. And then you're seeing it in cyberspace as well, with the Russians and Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, some other countries, particularly authoritarian regimes, looking to design a world that is an alternative to the US and Western-led world, in which there's great clarity about who's on the internet at any given time, so you can hunt down dissidents, in which the government has extraordinary control over speech and has an ability to contain protest. And you see it, that part of the Iron Curtain is much more a virtual one and wrapped up in Russian and Chinese concepts, which differ in some important respects in how you control information and thus the people behind them. But in China's case, and we haven't spoken as much about China here, we have seen the emergence of a real strategy from the Biden administration. I would say actually more so in China's case than in Russia's case. And in the Chinese case, what has the strategy been? First, cutting off their access to the most advanced Western chips. That is to say, those that run on circuitry with diameters of 3 nanometers or smaller. It's the most advanced chips that are produced largely by Taiwan Semiconductor, even if they are designed by NVIDIA or Apple or whatever. And that gets to our Taiwan vulnerability, because even though President Biden has been getting those companies, Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor, many others, to build facilities in the US, if you look at the administration's most optimistic prognosis of where we will be in 2030, their estimate is that we will be producing fully 20% of the most advanced chips. Now, I don't think we're going to get there by 2030, but let's take their number. Could we survive in a China-Taiwan conflict, losing 80% of the most advanced chips that we now regularly use in our military systems, in our communication systems, to keep CSIS and the New York Times running? I don't think so. So while I think they've been doing the right thing in depriving the Chinese of these advanced chips and, most importantly, the equipment to make them, I don't think we're running fast enough here in the United States to make up the difference. The other part of the strategy along the way with the Chinese has been to press them on a range of other global issues in an effort to find those areas of common interest that we can work together on. And we've had them historically. Obama struck a climate deal with them. As I've mentioned to you earlier, when the Iran nuclear negotiations happened, Russia and China were sitting on our side of the table trying to contain
That would
us.
not be the case if we were to sit down with them again.
8 years later, and I don't think we are going to sit down again, but let's assume we did, you would be looking at them across the table. And so I think Biden has set us on the right direction of more self-reliance. COVID helped, I think, make people understand the supply chain problem. But I just don't see the urgency to move as quickly as I think we might need to. Russia, it's a much harder case, because in China, you're dealing with a rising power, and you do have common interests, and you do have regular consultations. With Russia, there has been one meeting between Biden and Putin. It was in June of 2021. That was 3 years ago. It was in Geneva. It was largely over the ransomware attacks on Colonial Pipeline. Ukraine came up briefly, but at the time, the US did not have the evidence that Russia was preparing to go in. And I think it's fair to say that whether Joe Biden gets reelected or not, one meeting will be all those two men ever have.
And actually, interestingly, and you talk about this in the book, even when Biden sent over his CIA director, he didn't get a direct meeting with Putin either. Once he got to Russia, he had a phone conversation, this was before the war, with Putin, who refused to meet him in person.
Well, Putin was down at his Sochi DACA, and yes, that conversation was over the phone. That was the one to warn Putin that the U.S. had seen the evidence of plans to invade Ukraine, and to describe to him very clearly what the cost of that would be, and to deliver a letter from Biden on that subject. And I hope it struck you as you were reading the book. I think you read more on-the-record description of those meetings from Bill Burns, from Avril Haines, and other intelligence folks than you've probably seen before. And it took some pressing, but they were willing in the end to go on the record.
I mean, one of the things that does strike one in reading the book is the access David had in interviewing a range of individuals, mostly on the record, not all on the record, and not just current officials too, but also previous ones. But Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Blinken, Secretary of State, and a wide range of others that help provide color and context in a range of these.
Milley's long on color.
Milley is long on, he is. One interesting question before coming back to some of the implications of the new Cold Wars, as you call it, is for budding writers, both in the physical audience, but also those watching. How did you come up with the idea to write? I'm sure you probably had several options in looking at the next book after your last one, which focused mostly on cyber-related issues. This was a slightly different, bigger in breadth.
Right.
So how did you come up with that? And also, what's your writing process like? I mean, you're also involved in just day-to-day Times activity. I know you had some time off for it, but how do you actually take on writing a book like this?
Well, let me do that in two parts, the concept and then the execution. In the concept, this book is a little more like The Inheritance and a second book that I had written right after Obama's or during Obama's first term, called Confront and Conceal, in that it is a history of some administrations. But I also wanted to do something deeper. I wanted to go back and ask the question, how did we all get this wrong? Not just the intelligence agencies, but the American public, about what the relationships with the superpowers was going to be like. And what do we learn from that as we're thinking going forward? So the book's really in two parts. It's this history that runs from basically the Bush administration, some of the Clinton administration, up to the end of Trump. And then a deep dive in the second part into the innards of the Biden administration. And so part of the execution then is, how do you pace a book like that? Because you can't get bogged in the history. The history section's about 150 pages, but you've got to move through pretty quickly before you then slow down to the current story. I had a remarkable editor, Kevin Dowden at Crown, who had edited The Perfect Weapon, cyber book. And both of these books are very narrative tales. I said at the beginning, you meet characters at the start, you carry them through, your editor makes sure that you've developed them, and you come back. In that way, it is more novelistic, or more like the documentaries that I've made with HBO. The second is, you get out and you show your reporting. So, I had my notes from that trip down the Never River, but Mary Brooks and I took off around the world. We went and had a long coffee with the president of Finland in his residence to talk about how he moved the Finns from this concept that we would never be part of NATO to we must be part of NATO. And he was fascinating because he was coming to the end of his term and he really wanted to go tell his story. We went to India and talked to the foreign minister who is sort of at the heart of the don't make us choose movement between the United States and China, that we're going to go find our own independent way. We spent a lot of time in Taiwan, at Taiwan Semiconductor, with their chairman, who's retiring, I think, next month. And he talked about Taiwan Semiconductor as the Silicon Shield, and whether he believed that in the end this would protect them against China. The conclusion I come to is it may now, but won't for long. So it's very much a book of reporting. And when you do that, you're out there to describe the characters and tell you how the chairman of Taiwan Semiconductor got trained in the United States at Berkeley, got swept back to come home, and thus how he became part of the identity of his country. These are, in the end, human stories. Mary drafted some parts, and I rewrote them. I drafted much, and she rewrote them. Our editor then went at it. The writing part is a really intense part of it. And what I sometimes worry about in academic works is we spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I say this as somebody who also teaches a course on national security, and not enough time thinking about how to tell the story in a way that people who are not normally engaged in these subjects, if this is the one book in 10 years they may read about international relations, will get sucked in. If it doesn't read novelistically, they're not likely to read it.
One interesting component of the book, actually two, on the Russians, and you've touched on them a little bit, but this requires us to think over several administrations about how we got some of these countries, particularly the Chinese and the Russians, wrong. So I want to talk a little bit about the Russians in really two questions. First is, how did we collectively in the U.S. and other Westerners miss signs after Georgia, after the Russians take Crimea, then after they move to the Donbass, then they go to Syria? How did we miss the signs? That's one. And two is there was also a failure from our intelligence community, and actually not just the U.S., but others as well, about the outcome of the war once the Russians invaded. I think the general view, and Chairman Milley said this publicly, was that this would be a relatively quick war. The Russians had the balance of power in their favor, but collectively, I think people underestimated the Ukrainians, overestimated the Russians, at least in the initial part of the war. So those are two big mistakes. How did we get the first and the second ones wrong, and what do they mean as we move forward?
Let me take the second one first, because it's a little narrower and a little easier. And by the way, it came after another intelligence failure. We had just come off of Afghanistan, which is a chapter in the book, where we overestimated the capabilities of the Afghan forces that we had spent 20 years training, and we underestimated how quickly the Taliban could take cities. So when you go into Bill Burns's office, or at least in the earlier days of the war when you were reading about this, he put a map that came out of those early discussions right over the little couch where his visitors sit. And it is the map showing the Russian plan for the 3-day run into Kyiv. And partly he's keeping it there as an interesting artifact. I never asked him whether you get to take these home when you're done with the job, but I bet you can't. The second is to remind everybody of a bit of humility about what assumptions we made about their capability. And the Russian story has been a remarkable one. I mean, in history, the Russians tend to start off badly and get their feet and momentum together. And that's kind of what's happened here in this particular case. But we did overestimate their capability. We underestimated the degree to which corruption had undercut their systems. You know, they had tires on vehicles that were rotted out because somebody had cleared out with the money for, you know, replacement parts. They had not taught their troops to be terribly imaginative, thus the 40-mile-long traffic jam with tanks and then fuel trucks periodically.
The satellite imagery for this, including ones that the Times showed, were stunning along these lines.
They were. And so all the Ukrainians had to do, with a little bit of guidance from us, was go find those fuel trucks and set off huge fireballs at various points in the 40 miles. So we overestimated the Russians, as we may be today overestimating the Chinese in some ways. I'm sure Xi Jinping has sort of asked himself that question. But then you asked a broader question, which is not really about tactical intelligence, but really about the biggest open source question, which is, where is a country going? Which is a combination of their will, their intentions, whether or not we are projecting our values on them. Every American president, from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump, at various moments made the argument, Trump in particular, that these countries would be driven first and foremost by their economic interests. And how often do we teach that in classes? So it wasn't in Vladimir Putin's economic interest to end up threatening his ability to sell oil and gas to Europe. But he did it anyway because he had a higher value that we didn't get. And you know, how many times did you hear Trump say, well, I'll make him the deal of the century? And that deal, whether he was talking about the Russians or the Iranians, was always, they will value getting money and trade with the United States more than they will value some other thing. And that is the pure American projection of our priorities on their hierarchy of priorities. You could ask the same question about China.
Absolutely.
Right? There's no way that it makes economic sense for the Chinese either to invade or choke off Taiwan. That is the Silicon Shield, right? They need Taiwan Semiconductor as much as we do. And yet, if you are 70 years old and leading China and you figure you've got maybe 10 years left, and you have promised that you are going to solve this problem that is left over from 1948-49.
And you have a DPP victory yet again.
Yeah. Then you may think to yourself, there are things more important than keeping my exports going.
So where do you, last two questions, and then the real upside for those here is that normally we do a Q&A session with the audience. This time, Dave's actually going to stick around and sign books. So you'll have the opportunity to talk to him and sign books. But briefly, where do Iran and North Korea fit into the new Cold Wars? Then I've got a final question about the future.
So this conflict has saved the North Koreans. I mean, all of a sudden, they have a steady flow of oil coming in from the Russians, right? The one thing that they were worried about being turned on and off was the Chinese basically had their hand on the valve, right? And would punish them when they went off and did missile tests or nuclear tests. Well, first of all, they're no longer interested in punishing them. And secondly, there are now additional sources. The North Koreans are selling their artillery rounds, including the 40 or 50-year-old ones that don't work, to the Russians. So they've had a new lease on life out of this. The Iranians have had a big technological upgrade, and they've been selling the drones and may soon be in a position to be selling considerable numbers of missiles to the Russians. But more importantly, this has given Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and some other players an opportunity to think and talk and try to feel out where their interests really do converge. They don't, as I said, have an alliance here, but they do have a partnership. And when Putin and she first got together, there was a big debate in the US government about how real this was. And one day I was on an on-the-record briefing that Colin Kahl, who's frequently here, and running
Former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy.
right, now running the Stanford program in Washington. He said to us, you know, I think this is real. I'm not telling you it's going to be a full-scale alliance, but I'm telling you this is going to be trouble for the next large number of years. And I thought, that's interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard, this was about probably early 23. First time I've ever heard a U.S. official say this in public. I'd had plenty say it to me, you know, off the record. And the next day, the president decided to have a press conference, and I was sitting in the Times seat. And he sometimes calls on me because he's known me since his Senate days, and the other reporters seem to be a generation younger, to my distress. So he called on me for the last question. And so I just asked him, do you believe this is for real? And he gave me a long answer that basically came down to, no, these guys can't learn how to get along. I don't believe Joe Biden believes that today. I think he believes now this is one of our central challenges. And last week I was doing a talk like this up at the 92nd Street Y, and the CEO of CNN, Mark Thompson, who used to be the CEO of the New York Times Company, was sitting in your equivalent chair, and he said to me, if there was one question you could ask at the presidential debates, what would it be, since he's sponsoring the first presidential debate? And I said, to my mind, it would be, tell me your plan for getting in the way of the Russia-China partnership.
We need a new name for it, by the way, if anybody can put on their thinking
Yeah.
cap. We called it, the Bush administration called some of these countries the axis of evil.
I don't think that one's going to work.
No, that
That
one's been used, but there's opportunity for some creative new thinking. Last question for you. This is the last page of the book, the epilogue. You say, for all the present risks, it is worth remembering that one of the most remarkable and little discussed accomplishments of the old Cold War conflict was the great powers never escalated their differences into a direct conflict. That is an 8-decade-long streak we cannot afford to break. What would it mean if we were to see direct conflict? And what do you think the odds are as we look?
I think the odds are a lot higher than they were in the Cold War because you have so many more players. When I said at the beginning that sort of we knew who the Russian decision makers were, we knew who had launch authority, they knew all that, we got into something of a predictable set of interchanges that actually resulted in the arms control talks that brought down the number of nuclear weapons from well over 10 or 20,000 in some cases to what we have today. And the last of those agreements runs out in February of 2026, not very far away. Today, we have much more unpredictability in the system. When you've got two major players on the other side with different interests, China and Russia, that adds considerably to the complexity. When you've got Iran and North Korea playing around the sides, having changed the dynamic, that adds to it. When you've got commitments to NATO that it's somewhat remarkable we have not yet seen, get into it directly with the Russians, that adds a lot to it. So I just think there are a lot more things that can go wrong, and this is, there are a lot of people who say this is more like 1914 or 1915. I'm not sure it's quite that bad yet, but
with nuclear weapons, which we did not have.
Which we did not have to worry about. So that's number one worry. The second worry I have is here at home. Because during the old Cold War, for all the differences between Democrats and Republicans, we had a fundamental consensus about what the American role in the world was. And this was a role that was not completely narrowly defined by our national interests. that we thought we had a responsibility that went broader. And that's been fundamentally questioned. It was the reason that the Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Taiwan bill was held up, but it also plays throughout the campaign. And it's basically at the core of the America First argument. And we've gone through periods in our history like this before, but it does raise the question that at the very moment that the world is getting a lot more complex, the American instinct to pull back to our borders and say, oh, it's all so messy out there, we just don't want to go deal with it, is about as strong as it's been in my lifetime. And history suggests that that instinct, while fully understandable, almost never works out the way you want it to.
Well, on that sobering note,
Yeah.
Let's hope that cooler heads prevail and that we don't retrench back into the U.S. homeland. David, thanks for taking time to talk with us today
Thank
on
you.
New Cold Wars. If everyone could join me in thanking David Sanger. And for those in this packed audience, we will now David will now sign copies of his book.
Well, thanks, and thanks for having me back here to CSIS. It's such a great institution, and you guys do such incredible work that we all rely on.
Great. Thanks, David.